the law of God. Look at it. It's a pack of lies from the lying pen of scribes. Jeremiah chapter 8, verse 8.
As a hostage in Beirut, I was a victim of a very ancient struggle over the ownership of the land of Israel.
I was kept largely in isolation for 5 years and given a Bible to read. I read it through twice. I had time. This was the book on which the whole thing was based, the book that seemed to explain Israel's claim to the land. And not surprisingly, since my release, I've been interested in just what kind of book this is. The British Museum is a great place for ancient civilizations, but not, it seems, for the Israelites.
Jonathan, having had a quick look around it, I don't see much that talks about the great history of ancient Israel. Where's that gone?
Well, it hasn't really gone anywhere, John. They're stories. And they're great stories. They're a part of the literary heritage of early Israel, but they're not stories which we can document archaeologically.
What does that mean? That the Old Testament is simply fiction? What about the Exodus from Egypt and invasion of Canaan?
We have no archaeological evidence for the invasion of Canaan.
The Israelites attacked Jericho and the walls miraculously collapsed.
Jericho was not defended by city walls at that time.
They slaughtered the inhabitants, then went on to do the same at other cities.
Many of the cities mentioned were not even occupied at the time.
And they took over the land of Canaan.
The Israelites were, in my opinion, they were Canaanites.
Really?
I've come to Israel to try to find out. The Old Testament says the Israelites conquered this land and created a great kingdom, destroying idol worship. Did the walls of Jericho fall before them in a miracle? Or have people been at war for thousands of years because they believe a fairy story?
I'm at the River Jordan. This is where the Israelites began to take over their promised land, according to the Bible. The Israelites may have had a hard time getting here to the River Jordan, but I'm not sure it was as difficult for them as it is for the modern traveller.
The river is the Israeli-Jordanian border, and that request is backed by force. If there was such a sign 3,200 years ago, the Israelites apparently ignored it.
They had just entered the land for the first time since leaving Egypt. Just as the Red Sea parted to let them out, so the River Jordan stopped its flow to let them in. It doesn't look much of an obstacle today, but in times of flood it can be the mighty river indeed. According to the book of Joshua, the miracles had only just begun. They went to Jericho.
Land of milk and honey? That's not a very good description of the Jordan Valley. Until you come to Jericho, the largest oasis in the Middle East. The modern city sprawls around the edge of the ancient one, which is just a huge mound of earth savaged by archaeologists digging into its history, checking up on whether the Israelites really did reduce a great city to dust.
On the seventh day they rose at dawn and marched 7 times round the city. The 7th time the priests blew the trumpets. Joshua said to the army, "Shout, the Lord hath given you the city." The army heard the trumpet sound, and they raised a great shout, and down fell the walls.
In the 1930s, John Garstang dug a hole in the mound which had once been ancient Jericho. And he declared that at the time of Joshua, Jericho was a walled city. He had found the walls, and he had found that suddenly, cataclysmically, the walls had collapsed. The Bible story was true. Bill Deaver is one of the many archaeologists now rewriting this history.
Jericho nowadays is regarded as one of the great scandals of biblical archaeology, where we really went wrong. We're looking here at the city wall of the late 3rd millennium BC, which was destroyed about 2300. This is the wall that John Garstang, working for the British in the 20s and 30s, identified as Joshua's wall, and he thought that the destruction was the destruction described in the book of Joshua, so he was obviously influenced by the biblical story.
As were lots of other people. Jericho became virtually a site of pilgrimage, the place where you could see the truth of a miracle. But then came a new excavation.
This is the deep trench on the west side of the mound that Dame Kathleen Kenyon cut in the 50s. What Kenyon did was to show that the wall was in fact built and destroyed 1,000 years before Joshua's time.
According to Kenyon, Jericho was undefended and abandoned by the time of Joshua. Garstang had misstated his wall by 1,000 years. Rather a big mistake.
So what was it that made Garstang think that this was the wall that Joshua destroyed?
Well, he may have been influenced already by the biblical story. He may have been influenced by his backers. They were evangelical, conservative Christian businessmen, and they probably had a certain result they desired.
How do you date a wall in a mound of compressed dust? To find out how Kenyon could be so sure, I visited another ancient city mound where archaeologists are sorting out what it contains. This is Tel Rehoboth.
The name Tel means accumulation of ancient cities one on top of the other. In the Middle East in general, they used to build their settlement sites one on top of the other. In this particular section, for example, we excavated almost 10 different cities, one on top of the other. And you can see in this section, a classic section through a mound, and we are standing now on one of the lowest one. In fact, it's not the lowest, we have even earlier. But this one dates from the 13th century BC. It should be the time of Moses, the Exodus.
Wow.
The people who lived here in this country during that time were Canaanites.
Yeah.
Every city left about 1 meter of debris. Yeah? So here you can see another brick wall, here one, here, and here, with a nice stone foundation.
Yeah.
And this is dated to the 12th century BC.
So would that be Joshua's time?
This will be more or less the time of Joshua.
Okay, then up another level. And so this is still 12th here?
12th century.
Okay.
Right. You can see here mud bricks. You see the mud bricks?
Yes, God,
You
very
see?
plain.
Very clear. And on top of these mud bricks, you have stone foundation.
Yeah.
On top of the stone foundation, again, there were mud bricks. So we have here two strata. A building
see.
that
Yeah.
was destroyed and rebuilt.
Yeah.
These are all dated to the 11th century BC.
So yet another 100 years up on here.
Yeah.
Okay.
We are in the 11th century, more or less the time of the judges. Okay?
It's an amazing spin through biblical history,
Up
isn't it?
in the ladder of time.
Yes, indeed.
And you can see how those tales were created. You can see that these people just threw rubbish into the street. They didn't have a municipality, taking the rubbish out of the city. So you have here layers and layers and layers and layers
But that's
and layers of
incredible.
accumulation just from few dozens years perhaps, maybe less than a century.
The rubbish includes so much broken pottery that you get the impression that every night in Canaan was party night, smashing the plates and bowls. But the design of pottery changes over time, and that's how each level can be dated. So every afternoon, the volunteers have to sit down and clean up every piece of broken pottery they've found.
Things. Can you identify them yet?
The indicative pieces are ones that can actually tell if there's something, such as that rim there, that may be a base
So you've got
or
something like
a
that
top.
that helps, yeah?
Right, that's indicative of the type of pottery that it came from, the pot or whatever. It may be a chalice or something. We
Do you
don't-
spend sort of much of every afternoon washing these flat body shards?
Oh yeah, yeah. We pick them up in the early morning, and we wash them in the afternoon, and then the next morning we watch them dump out the ones that we can't use, so that we
spend all
wash.
morning digging them and then they throw them away again.
Yes, exactly.
That's good.
Well, how accurate can you get date-wise from looking at the pottery shards?
We know already, even from a rim such as this, what the whole vessel looks like.
Right.
And Of course, the vessel as a whole is very typical of the period, but if you only have bits and pieces, usually the rim can tell you the most, rather than such a body shirt as this that could really belong to any time in the 9th century, 8th century or so.
Jericho is a tell just like Rahov. It's the accumulated rubbish from thousands of years of mud brick houses. A process that's still going on today, as the mud brick homes of Palestinian refugees are bulldozed within sight of the ancient city. And from the rubbish found in the remains, each level of occupation can be dated. Now there's a new excavation going on at Jericho. Biblical stories can be roughly dated because the Bible tells a continuous tale that includes known and dated events. To find traces of Joshua, we should be looking at rubbish from the 13th or 12th century BC. Trouble is, Hamdan Taha can't find any.
We are standing on a mud brick structure dating back to circa 1600 before Christ. And as you see, this is the surface of the till.
Yeah.
So no occupation took place after the abandonment of the site at the end of the 16th century. There is nothing, at least from archaeological results, to indicate that the site was inhabited when Joshua came to the site according to the biblical legend.
But the Palestinian Authority in charge of this dig also needs tourists. So they have not put up any notices saying, "No miracles happened here."
It's marvellous to come all the way from Australia and to stand on the spot that they say is the site of Jericho of the Old Testament, and to look down across the Jordan River and to just think of the children of Israel coming and marching around that city. It's very soul satisfying.
And is it something you can actually sort of visualise, knowing the text very well? You imagine the hordes of people coming across the river.
I can see it in my mind, yes, yeah. And standing on the tell, it's just incredible to think that that actually happened.
In the 13th century, where we would now date the Israelite exodus and conquest, if any, there is no occupation here at all. I always say to people, if you want a miracle, here's your miracle. Joshua destroyed a site that wasn't even there. Today, almost all scholars, both biblical scholars and archaeologists, accept the fact that Jericho cannot have been destroyed by the incoming Israelites. Something is wrong with the story.
As the archaeological picture of Jericho has been revised, the whole connection with biblical history has been broken. Why have things changed? A number of archaeologists told me that the results you get depend on who is doing the digging.
You see, in the 30s, most archaeologists working here in Israel were not archaeologists at all, not professionals, but they were mostly clerics or theologians who came here, and the main aim was to look for the Israelite conquest, and they were looking everything through the biblical prism. Now, at the end of the 40s and the beginning of the 50s, right around the years of the independence of Israel, the archaeology of Israel turned to be a nationalistic archaeology.
In place of theologians with a spade in one hand and a Bible in the other, biblical sites were now being dug up by Israeli army veterans. Spade in one hand, Bible in the other, and some machine gun over the shoulder.
There were a lot of religious people, there were secular people, but for them, archaeology and whatever came from the spade was the proof of the connection between modern Israel and ancient Israel. With the Prime Minister, Ben-Gurion, he had meetings at his home with all these former generals and now archaeologists that, and the books that they were interested were the books of Joshua, the books of Judges, the books that showed how the Israelites came to be in their own land.
Zionism, the idea that Jews should move to Palestine and rebuild their lost country, created the State of Israel. The development of archaeology in this area goes hand in glove with politics. There is now a Palestinian Department of Antiquities responsible for the excavations at Jericho. Biblical Jericho has become Palestinian Tel el-Sultan. And instead of supporting Israel's special claim to the land, archaeologists now seem to be denying it. After all, why is this a Jewish state if this is not the promised land of the Old Testament? the book of Joshua names 12 cities where the Israelites killed all the Canaanites. But today's archaeologists say that 11 of the 12 were either uninhabited or undamaged. And with the new archaeology comes a new version of history.
The Israelites never were in Egypt. They never came from abroad. This whole chain of event is broken, is not a historical one. It's a later legend, reconstruction of an ancient history by sometimes during the 7th century, which never happened.
Zev Herzog works in Tel Aviv, a modern city built on virgin land with no biblical foundations. Home to a lot of people who prefer religious issues to take a back seat.
Well, this could be the nightlife of any big city, but I'm in Israel on the evening of a major religious festival. This is Tel Aviv, and it could be anywhere. And that's the big difference between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. It's the same holiday in Jerusalem, and I've come looking for the busy social life of the city. This is supposed to be it. But there's not a lot happening.
Tel Aviv plays, Jerusalem prays. And this is reflected in a political struggle over how to achieve peace. Secular Israelis may want to exchange biblical land for peace, while many Orthodox Jews call that betrayal. That's why Zev Herzog wanted people to know that the whole story of the Exodus and conquest seems to be untrue.
Well, I believe that this development contribute very nicely to the progress and the process of Israel into a modern state, this Israeli society into more enlightened community, freed from messianic and strong religious beliefs, and being part of the modern world, as I would wish it to be.
But when a national newspaper carried an article by him saying that the Israelites did not arrive from Egypt, he alarmed many Israelis who have no religious belief, as he was told by one government official.
He said that once he read this article, and with my statement that there was no Exodus, that we did not came from Egypt, he couldn't sleep for 3 days. And he's a secular person, and he's has a position in the Ministry of Education.
Zev Herzog hoped that secular people would find the news story helpful, but the emotional and political significance of saying the Exodus and conquest is a fairy story worries even secular politicians in Israel's parliament.
But I'm defending the Bible exactly because I'm not religious. I don't think that the archaeologist who is doing this in order to give somebody a reason to destroy us. But nevertheless, he is providing ammunition against us. Of course, the Bible is our mythology, even if you are not religious. And therefore, people want to diminish the stature of the Bible based on archaeological nitty-gritty, are really aiming to destroy the justification of the Zionist existence of the Jews in Israel nowadays.
A week after Herzog published his article, I saw in The Spectator a headline, Israeli archaeologists undermine Israel's territorial claims. Definitely we are talking here, or this has political repercussions, no question. Unfortunately, we don't want it. I don't want it. I don't think that archaeology and politics should go together, but inevitably they do.
Funnily enough, it's secular people who are most likely to be upset by this challenge to biblical history. This is the Jewish quarter of Jerusalem, where the Bible is the stuff of daily life. What does an Orthodox rabbi think of what Herzog is saying?
Well, I'm not an archaeologist, but my understanding is that even among the archaeologists there are differences of opinion. I think that it doesn't really make a difference to me, not because I'm a closed-minded person, because I've got my views set, but rather because I have a document. What they haven't yet found in the ground, they haven't yet found in the ground. It doesn't mean that tomorrow they won't find something else in the ground that'll put them on the right track.
The faithful can simply say that archaeologists haven't found things yet and haven't understood what they have found. That's the nature of faith. And the evidence about Joshua is not entirely one way. 11 of the 12 cities he is said to have captured were uninhabited or undamaged. But the 12th? Hazor was the only city Joshua is said to have burned to the ground.
But as for the cities that stood still in their strength, Israel burned none of them save Hazor only. That did Joshua burn.
This palace came to an end in a terrible fire, signs of which you can see everywhere. For example, the stairs, which have exploded, basalt, exploded to millions of pieces. Look at this wall here. See all this charcoal, all this burnt mud brick, all those vitrified mud brick over there. All this is really intense fire. The entire floor here, not only the walls had wood in them, the ceiling, of course, and the floors as well, which is rather unusual. And we find these pieces of charcoal. Actually, we had planks of 80 by 60 centimeters. The entire floor was a wooden floor, you know, like in Versailles or what have you. So it was a real, unusual, the mother of all destructions, okay? A real destruction.
Do you know when Hazor was destroyed, and could it have been by Joshua?
Wow.
It's a big question, though.
It's one of the very big questions. Of course, it is not necessarily so as in Joshua, but it's also not necessarily not so. We have to wait and see until we get something more concrete. Let's keep our minds open and not exclude automatically the possibility as we have it in the Old Testament in its entirety.
But there must be something wrong with the biblical story. I'm now finding out that when the Israelites are supposed to have escaped from Egypt and entered Canaan, Canaan was ruled by Pharaoh. It doesn't say that in the Bible. This is Afek, a military center near Tel Aviv. At the time of the story of the Exodus, in the 13th century BC, this was an Egyptian garrison.
The Egyptians are not mentioned at all in the story, and that is one of the best clues, if you wish, for the fact that the story does not describe a real-time reality of the 13th century BC, because if there was a prominent element in Canaan in the 13th century BC, at the time of the great Ramses II, that element was the Egyptian administration.
This building was the Egyptian HQ.
From the 15th century to the 12th century BC, during the 3 centuries, Egypt controlled Canaan, and Canaan was a province of Egypt with Egyptian administrators living in Canaan and stationed in several places, including this one.
So there would have been no point in leaving Egypt. There is no evidence that Joshua conquered this land. Mind you, there's no archaeological evidence that William the Conqueror took over England in 1066. But then the Bible also says that the Israelites uniquely believed in one single God. And yet there is compelling evidence that they worshipped a goddess as well.
Because if the Israelites believed in one invisible God, what were these little ladies doing in all their homes?
Whatever happened to Mrs. God? And just when did the Bible put women in their place? That's for next week.